Oh, hello, and welcome to something completely different from what I normally do. Today, I will be working on this little art study, and while that's going on, I'll chat a bit about how I decide on art projects.
If you don't know me, I am Camilla, or I guess you can call me Rainy, since my handle is Rainy Craze everywhere. I am a graphic designer and aspiring illustrator with the goal of living a fantasy art life in the mountains. And I am in the middle of a flux, a crisis if you will. So while I tell you about it, I'll be working on some art studies. Here I'm doing some hand practices, but I got pretty frustrated with my file setup, so in a minute you'll see me switching to study Riekkinen, because I want to learn from her style and see if I want to incorporate it into an upcoming project. Rikka is a fantasy illustrator from Finland. I became aware of her for her awesome caduceus clay portrait, and I really like her portrait sketch style, though her fully rendered work is also beautiful. You can find her on Twitter at Artveris, on kofi.com/midorisa, and at midorisa.art on Instagram. Okay, jumping right into it. How do I decide what art project to do? First, a big rambly example, followed by a concise summary, and then another bit of rambles for details. In preparation for a new big video I'm planning, because apparently I think in big projects, I did a few days of research, proper research at that, and I came to the realization that the project I was planning was not at all going to work. That realization was a bit jarring because I had such a specific vision in my head. It's something I wanted to do partly for fun, partly for the content, and partly as a portfolio piece as well. And if I want to use this as a portfolio piece, then it really does need to serve one singular purpose really well. Well, I mean, for fun and for content are totally valid purposes, and the project could still end up as all three. But a portfolio piece has to be strong enough to stand out on its own. It must be more or less independently persuasive. Advertising that persuades someone to take an action, like persuading an art director to hire an illustrator for collectible card game art. So I have a decision to make. Do I make my original vision the way I had it in my head and reduce its purpose to just the illustrative value, or do I make the project with the purpose I envisioned and change the form to fit the function? I know that sounds pretty vague, so without giving any spoilers for my next big videos, I guess in layman terms that means make a cool picture for the sake of telling a story, or make a functional thing with art that fits. The designer in me certainly leans towards the latter, but the illustrator in me that needs that further training wants to do the big pretty thing and learn from it. This really gave me pause, and I came to the conclusion I also need to change the way I'm approaching YouTube. That seems like a bit of a stretch conclusion, talking about A versus B, therefore H. But the big projects with videos that take up time, but come on an unpredictable schedule, aren't getting me to where I want to be on YouTube. And that same sentiment is also in my learning illustration journey, in that I'm making seemingly big illustration projects for myself, but not improving at the rate I want. So here I am, making more studies and speed paints to get that further training I need, but much more bite-sized, and making more frequent videos out of that. As an aside, I also need to learn how to juggle production for multiple videos at a time, and as a natural monotasker, that's really hard, but I suspect that also just comes with practice. So with the illustrator in me learning through these bite-sized studies, I've decided the next best portfolio piece would probably be the functional one, as it will merge a strength and a growing skill together, rather than trying to shoehorn in a totally different skill into a pre-existing design portfolio. The illustration portion should also be easier since it's more singularly focused, whereas the big pretty thing would have a very complex setup. take longer to do right, and maybe still not be at the skill level worthy of a portfolio. Hard work is the prerequisite, and I have to put in a lot of time either way. But if I can figure out the smarter choices along the way, then I may not need to repeat the same steps so much. I know the learning curve isn't exactly linear, but maybe I can make it less dramatic in some stretches. Or maybe that's not what I want in a learning curve. Maybe I want a learning curve to be really dramatic. I forget how I don't make graphs. I still definitely want to make the big, sexy storytelling picture, but I think I'll benefit from working up to it and maybe even changing the base concept. Though it's a pretty great concept if I do say so myself. I'll have to be pretty blown away by another idea. And that idea may not actually come from myself. It may be entirely derivative, but that's not necessarily a bad thing in the fantasy illustration space. An awful lot of people get noticed because of fan works, and for better or worse, commercial clients really want to know that an artist can work with an existing IP before hiring him. That's really the point of a portfolio, after all. All that to say, that is my general approach on deciding what art project to do. I jot down all of my ideas, probably start thumbnails to get my original visuals and energy down, and very often with little notes on those sketches, and then start research. If the research gives me pause, then I measure my options and decide which likely results are most appealing. And by research, I don't necessarily mean the academic kind of research we're all used to from school. If you like writing academic research papers for fun, knock yourself out. A ton of YouTubers do that, actually, now that I think about it. Podcasts too. But no, I mean more like looking up specific references for the actual thing I'm making. If I'm studying hands, I find lots of photos of hands in different lighting, poses, accessories, age, occupations, etc., etc. If I want to make a book cover, I look up book cover art directors and figure out how they decide on book covers. If I'm making up a new brand identity for a fan art, I look up actual case studies of brands that roughly correlate in the real world. I make notes when I learn new stuff and keep track of the major points of that thing. And from there, I revisit the idea. And I pretty much always have to make a slew of new thumbnails because now I am informed and I can combine that with my original sketches or, more often than not, get entirely new, exciting ideas.
If this is making any sense, please pop the like button or drop a comment below.
And now a continuation of that thought. How do I decide what ideas to go with? Same principle. Get it all out and then cut it way down. And the ideas start with thumbnails. I'm a bit old school, not only in the sense that W was my second Bush president, but also in that I do way better thumbnail sketches with a pencil in my sketchbooks. I do it so much, in fact, that I made myself a few templates for making thumbnail dimensions. You know, those little rectangles that roughly correlate to the aspect ratio of the final media. Those rectangle templates make it super fast to lay down a whole page of thumbnails, which is great because my best stuff seems to come from the surplus of ideas. The first handful of ideas are usually pretty not that compelling, so in a way it's like I have to get all the bad ideas unclogged before I can get to the good stuff. Or in gym bro terms, gotta get those warm-up reps in before the real exercise begins. I just recently read an old article on muddy colors. Best art blog out there because it is a conglomerate of industry professionals. This one was written by Dan Dos Santos about his process for the book cover for Trailer Park Faye. Now there's a lot to be said for this whole article, mostly because it's a whole article of words and pictures. One paragraph by Dan really stuck out to me. I typically give the client about 3 sketches to choose from. I try to make sure these sketches aren't just 3 iterations of the same idea with just slightly different poses or camera angles. Instead, I like to provide a variety of options. Like one sketch that focuses on the narrative, one that focuses on the character, and maybe one that's an action piece or something less portrait driven. So in this case, Dan isn't talking about his thumbnails. I wouldn't be surprised if he makes 50 thumbnails for each of those variations. I also wouldn't be surprised if he did 5 thumbnails total for this job. He's been doing this long enough and has made hundreds of book covers. He's just as likely to have refined his hand-vision coordination that much. But the part that sticks out to me is presenting 3 totally different focuses, because thinking through 5 thumbnail variations on the narrative, then 5 on the character, then 5 on action is way easier than point blank, think up 15 totally different ideas. Go. Grouping is a super important concept in composition across all arts. Of course it would make sense in the ideation phase. As for settling on the best idea when I am directing my own project, sometimes the right thing just stands out. But when several ideas seem equally valid, I tend to do one of 2 things. One is put those ideas aside for a day or so and let it stew in the back of my mind, i.e., I don't actively think about it. This will hopefully let me come back with a fresh mind, and hopefully one of those ideas sticks out better. Or 2, I break out my slightly larger sketching template and make a more detailed version of each of those thumbnail ideas. This will help me work through some of those trickier bits, and I can more easily see what would be more effective or workable. In the most dire of circumstances, I do both, or go back to the drawing board entirely. But the worst is when I wake up to the apathy of this fallen world and succumb to the throngs of depression and just abandon the entire thing. But then a week of really good sleep habits gets me excited for life again. It's like I can be as mentally and spiritually healthy as I can, but ignoring the bodily health of my human being makes everything else fall apart. Funny how that works. I have a theory that mental health is mostly physical health, but I only know people in hard sciences and practical medical experts, and not psych sciences, so I have a very biased data set. Not that it has anything to do with this topic. And here's what I have gotten out of that study session. I see all of my errors compared to who I was trying to emulate, but that's what these learning exercises are for.
Want to see a bit more of my process? Here's another video you can check out. And have a super duper day.